The history of Edmonton is tied to the North Saskatchewan River. For thousands of years, the river brought Aboriginal people here to Amisquaskehagen, the Beaver Hills. Later, the river also brought fur traders, missionaries, and settlers.
The river made Edmonton, but it exacted a steep price. For example, a massive flood forced John Rowand and the Hudson's Bay Company to move Fort Edmonton from Rossdale to what became the legislature grounds in 1830.
Despite the risk of flooding, by the early 1900s, Edmonton's river flats were home to many businesses, including coal mines, lumber mills, brickyards, a tannery, and a brewery.
Around these new businesses and the power and water plants, residential neighborhoods of small cottages and modest frame houses sprang up.
Everyone knew the river could flood again, but with a world war in Europe, most Edmontonians had more immediate concerns in the summer of 1915.
No one suspected that heavy winter snows, days of torrential rain combined with rapid runoffs in the mountains, made worse by logging, had created a potential disaster.
The first hint of Edmonton's danger was a simple but chilling message sent from Rocky Mountain House on Sunday, June 27, 1915. "My God, Edmonton, look out! The river's up 20 feet and still jumping."
With no radio and no easy way for officials to warn people living by the river, the news traveled slowly at first. City employees were sent out to tell residents, get out of the valley.
At first, the river rose slowly, and most valley residents remained calm. Many thought it was a false alarm, or that the worst of the flooding would be over long before the crest reached Edmonton. John Walter was sure the crest would remain below the riverbanks.
That changed when the river started rising a foot or more an hour. Hour by hour, the water rose until it peaked at 42 feet, or almost 13 meters above normal.
As the river burst its banks, it flooded the communities on the river flats, washing away houses, stores, businesses, and carrying tons of debris off down the river. All of a sudden, people rushed to try to save what they could.
John Walter tied his steamboat, the City of Edmonton, to a clump of trees by his lumber mill as his dock washed away. Jimmy Phillips of Walterdale moved all of his belongings to the second floor of his house before wading away to higher ground. He got out safely, but forgot his wallet. By the time he could go back, he had to swim through rising waters and climb into his house through a second-floor window.
Within hours, people realized the scale of the disaster. With many Edmonton men away on military service, the remaining valley population struggled to save themselves, their pets, and a few prized possessions.
City officials organized emergency shelters, and carts, wagons, and cars descended on the affected areas to help. When cars and carts could no longer get through, rescue boats began ferrying stranded families and their meager goods to higher ground.
Gus Gumas had an ice cream stand near the low-level bridge, and later remembered the scene.
The crowd was in a real holiday mood. In fact, I couldn't serve them fast enough. When the bridge was closed, my supply had to be rerouted over the high level. Yet I sold over $500 worth, with the swollen hands to prove it.
While some enjoyed the spectacle, other worrying issues appeared. City services started to fail. The Rossdale power plant flooded, and by nightfall on Monday, the city was without electricity. The waterworks plant also closed down, meaning there was no safe drinking water. As the numbers of evacuated people rose, newspapers appealed for assistance.
Money, provisions, and clothing needed at once.
The biggest worry became the safety of the low-level bridge. Stables, shacks, and even complete houses washed down the river and crashed into it. Then a large barn from John Walter's property hit the bridge. It jammed under the bridge deck and threatened to back the flood waters up.
Locomotives under a full head of steam were placed at either end of the bridge so the heavily laden cars could be pulled off at the first sign of collapse. Most thought the bridge was doomed, but luck and this desperate attempt to weigh the bridge down saved it.
Fortunately, the river fell as quickly as it had risen. The crest passed Edmonton early Tuesday, and by that evening the river was back in its normal channel. All that remained was to count the cost.
Amazingly, no one was killed or even seriously injured, although one man had to spend 12 hours stranded on top of a road grader when the flood surrounded him.
Reports at the time suggest about 2,000 people were homeless, and as many as 50 houses were swept away completely, and 700 severely damaged. To save their houses, people tied them to trees and telephone poles, but many simply floated off whatever their owners tried.
We will probably never know the full extent of the damage, although property losses have been estimated at between $500,000 and $1 million, huge sums in 1915 and devastating to the working-class families whose property was destroyed.
It was not just ordinary people who paid the price either. Businesses on Rossdale, Walterdale, and Gallagher Flats were also hard hit.
John Walter, reputed to be Edmonton's first millionaire, never recovered from the devastation of his lumberyard, ferry, and other businesses. Within a few years, his large house on Walterdale Flats was all that remained of his once expansive business empire. Power and water plants reopened, but many other businesses just absorbed their losses and moved out of the river valley to higher ground. Wealthy Edmontonians congratulated themselves on their decision to live in neighborhoods such as Glenora, Grode Estate, and the Highlands, well away from the river.
The flood was a hammer blow to the city's development, but it did have some benefits. By slowing and even reversing development in the river valley, it made it much easier for the city later to develop its remarkable system of river valley parks.
Years after, Elsie Lloyd suggested another more modest and immediate benefit to the flood. She noted that while all their furniture was ruined, and her father only saved their house by tying it to the trees in their yard, the sweet williams along the walk bloomed better than ever that year.
It also provided a great opportunity for children to do what they do best, have fun in the most desperate of circumstances. As Fred Barnes reminisced.
Well, I'll always remember the flood. When the 105th Street Bridge had nearly went out and all this sawmill stuff went all the way down the river, we had a ball then. We went down on the flats and used the wooden sidewalks. We were floating around. We'd pull ourselves over in front of a house and then holler for help, and they'd come and rescue us. We spent all day getting rescued.
In fact, like Gus, Fred, Elsie, and Jimmy, Edmontonians never completely forgot those dramatic days in 1915 when the river jumped its banks, the low-level bridge almost collapsed, and people decided the river was better to look at than live beside.